Does Amnesia Rebirth take the Amnesia franchise to the next level? I'm the Gladdest. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. If you like the content, please be sure to like and subscribe. That would really mean a lot to me. If you've been watching my spicy content, I just finished playing through Amnesia Rebirth not that long ago. If you want, you could go ahead and watch the playthrough I did. I'm going to put a little link up here in the top right hand corner. Just like my last review, I'm going to keep this one unscripted. I feel like that way it'll feel a lot more like a conversation and a thought process rather than a scripted speech. So I'm going to stick to that. Let me know what you think down below in the comments, though. I would really appreciate feedback. I will probably be doing more reviews in the future, so I want to definitely make sure they get better and better as time goes on. I'm going to organize this review in about 4 or 5 different categories that I hope will help paint an effective picture on the game as a whole and its effectiveness as a story-driven horror survival game. Also, something to note, I have played through all of Amnesia Dark Descent, and I've played about half to 2/3 of Machine for Pigs, but me and the people I played with, we kind of stopped and it kind of fluttered out about halfway through-ish because it didn't pull us in. It wasn't that interesting of a game, and I don't think it's ultimately that great, especially when compared to Amnesia Dark Descent, but that's kind of beside the point. I think that in some regard, comparing Amnesia Rebirth to The Dark Descent and Machine for Pigs is helpful and effective. I think that doing so does help paint a better picture in terms of what to expect in the series, but I'm going to be reviewing this game primarily as its own game. If I loved Dark Descent a lot more than this game, I feel like it would negatively affect my review simply because, well, Dark Descent was better. So I'm going to try to keep the review as isolated as possible to Amnesia Rebirth, but I am going to tie it back to elements of Dark Descent and Machine for Pigs if I feel like it will be helpful in painting that better, more effective picture. Also, before I get into this, I also want to quickly say that I tried to keep this review as spoiler-free as possible, but there are 2 sections in this review/analysis that I would consider slightly spoily, if that makes sense. Basically, at a part in the video, I talk about monsters, and then I also talk about the story. So if you don't want to know about what the monsters look like or what type of monsters there are in the game, then just feel free to skip that section. I put timestamps below of all the sections of the video, so obviously you can just skip right past it. When I talk about the story, I give a very brief overview of the main idea behind the story, right? I don't spoil any major plot events or anything like that, but I do give like a general overview of the story, so if you like going into these kinds of games blind, in terms of the story, then I would recommend skipping that as well. The story part comes right after the monster part, so you can just skip that section, that big 2-parter section. The first thing I'm going to be talking about, which arguably I think is one of the most important parts of a horror game, is the scare factor. Did the game effectively scare me? To answer that question simply, yeah, it did. It really did scare me on multiple levels, multiple times. Something that the Amnesia series does really well is provide this deeply seated sense of fear, because the game is inherently very ambiguous and it's surrounded by this intense feeling of the unknown and fear of the unknown, fear of the dark. As you walk through the numerous dark corridors in the game, the player keeps thinking to themselves, is there a monster? Is it going to come around the next corner? How dark is it going to be for the rest of this progression? I think the Amnesia series really builds on this idea of the unknown really well, and I think it does that really well with proper uses of jump scares, but not too many, with countless dark and spooky corridors that are, in nature very ambiguous, and also this innate feeling of dread that follows people when they're entering into this unknown, this new territory, the unique landscapes that are presented in this game. Amnesia Rebirth definitely instilled this feeling of dread and the unknown in me when I played almost the entire time. Amnesia Rebirth, like its predecessors and like, most horror games that have been created, there are a variety of jump scares, which I think is fine. Jump scares are a commonly used and usually effective form of scaring people in scary games, right? But I think it's important to dive a little bit deeper into, the use of a jump scare. There's a difference between a game that utilizes jump scares and a game that relies on jump scares. For example, the very first game I played through on my channel was Slender the Arrival. I feel that Amnesia Rebirth is set apart from games like Slender the Arrival because it does not rely on jump scares. Don't get me wrong, I actually enjoyed playing through Slender the Arrival, but I think it relied too much on jump scares to the point where, even though I would still get scared at the jump scares, it didn't help to implant in my brain this idea of what is going to happen. And it didn't pull me in enough to make me feel immersed in what's happening around me. Instead, it utilized jump scares to make me be afraid of when the next jump scare is going to happen. So ultimately, I would say Amnesia Rebirth is genuinely scary. The enemies in the game, along with the ambiguity presented in the atmosphere, the setting, the unknown, tied with the deep immersive story that I'm going to get to in a minute, I think ultimately this game creates a genuinely scary experience that also pulls in the player, which I think is very rare these days with scary games. Do I think this game is more scary than Amnesia The Dark Descent in terms of implementing a more deeply seated fear in the player? I would say yes, it does. In terms of monsters and jump scares, I would say Amnesia The Dark Descent did it a little bit better. I'm also going to really quickly talk about the monsters in Amnesia Rebirth. There are basically two main types of monsters. There's the ghouls and the wraiths. I don't know what the wraiths are called. I think they're just called wraiths. The ghouls remind me of those flesh monsters in Dark Descent, but they're a little bit more human, which I think honestly makes them feel more scary. I remember there was a part right when I entered the castle for the first time and I encountered the ghoul up close and personal. The ghoul picked me up and, grabbed me and picked me up, and it was looking right at my face, and the game did a close-up of the ghoul's face. And honestly, I was ready to be like, oh, that's what it looks like? But honestly, when it did, I was like, seeing its face made me more scared, which I think is a huge nod to the game itself. To be able to do that, to be able to see a monster close up and still think it's scary in a horror game, pretty good, pretty well done. I'm happy about that. The wraiths, I can honestly take it or leave it. I don't think when I encountered the wraiths, it was necessarily that interesting. I liked the idea of, avoiding it, sneaking around it, hiding behind things, make sure you didn't get in its light. I thought it was really cool the first or second time. But then after that, I feel like it kind of lost its charm. But maybe that's just me. Now, in terms of the monsters, I definitely think that one of the absolute scariest encounters I've ever had in a survival horror game is the water monster, the invisible water monster in Dark Descent. That whole section is so incredibly terrifying for me that I can barely even describe it. So I was really hoping there would be something like that in this game, but there weren't. And that's okay, but I would have hoped they would have put like a totally new, unique experience or encounter with some kind of like crazy special monster, I don't think they really did that in Rebirth. The wraiths are kind of cool, but it just kind of feels like any other enemy that you have to sneak by. So the next section I'm going to be getting into is the story of the game. Is the story any good? Does the story pull me in? Does it make me care about the characters? Does it make me want to know what happens next and be interested in what has happened enough? To answer that briefly, I would say overall Amnesia Rebirth has a really good story. I wouldn't call it amazing, but I would say it's really good. It's definitely good enough to pull the player into the horror elements in a way that makes them want to keep going forward even though it's scary. To summarize the story briefly for those of you who may not know, the main protagonist, your character, is Tassi Trianon. Tassi goes, with her husband Salim and some others, to a gold mine somewhere in an undisclosed part of a desert. On the way there, the plane crashes and everybody is stranded in the desert. Tassi wakes up with amnesia in the plane crash. Nobody's there. Tassi goes step by step trying to recover her memory, try to find Salim and the others, figuring out what happened. I think that sets up a really effective way for a story to unfold. Right off the bat, Tassi relates to the player because neither person knows what's going on. So as Tassi relearns what happened, the player learns for the first time what happened. So I think those two elements tie perfectly together to make the game's story unfold fluidly, effectively, and it keeps the game interesting. I think Tassi as a character is relatable, has an interesting personality, and is structured with an amazing voice actor who does an amazing job. Like I said, I think the story unfolds in a way that's very effective, and I think that coupled with the interesting protagonist, Tassi, I think they culminate into a really great, exciting, and enthralling experience. I'm now quickly going to talk about the soundtrack and audio of Amnesia Rebirth. The soundtrack to Amnesia Rebirth is honestly one of the best soundtracks I have heard in any survival horror game in a long time. The soundtrack, simply put, is amazing. It was created by the Finnish composer Mikko Tarmia. I think that's how you pronounce the name. I probably butchered it. I apologize. I don't think this game would be nearly as good as it is without the soundtrack. I think this soundtrack finds a really happy medium between a super horrific and scary ambient soundscape and also with an amazingly well put together musical composition. Now, I'm definitely not a composer. I'm definitely not an expert on composition, but what I do know, this soundtrack effectively pulls the player in, not only into the game and into, the feeling of being afraid, but just no matter where you are, you feel as if you were there with the music. Going along with the soundtrack of Amnesia Rebirth, the audio design and the audio effects are also really, really well done. Whether it be something as simple as hearing your own footsteps as you walk in a corridor, or hearing the wind flow through a tunnel or a cave system, you really feel like you're there, in the moment, in the scene, surrounded by this feeling of dread that is a recurring theme that I keep talking about, but also in the game itself. I think honestly one of the greatest things about the Amnesia series are the sound effects. I think it was Tapio Luukkonen, I probably mispronounced that, I apologize. He was the one who did the sound designs for The Dark Descent, and if anybody's played The Dark Descent, the sound design is just so incredibly accurate and fine-tuned to every situation you're in. I'm going to go ahead and post a link in the description. There's a video called Making of Amnesia, and it's like the sound designer making certain sounds. It's truly incredible. But back to Amnesia Rebirth, I think that just like the sound effects in The Dark Descent, I think the sound effects in Amnesia Rebirth are also really, really well done and really, really accurate. Not only are the sounds very accurate, but I think they're also very well placed in terms of where you are as you progress through a certain scene. A perfect example of this is when you first exit one of the caves, you see this huge expanse and the music starts to play, and then you hear the wind and you could feel, you feel as if you're there, and you could hear your steps and you could hear this eeriness in the air and feel the eeriness. And I think that the sound effects and the sound design, along with the soundtrack, really help to bring this experience home and really help to immerse the player. Just to kind of give a really good example of sound effects really immersing the player in a specific scene, I'm gonna go ahead and play a little snippet from me playing. And
What?
oh!
I can't stay here. I'm so sorry, my love.
Again.
I'll do everything I can to keep her safe.
Ultimately, the sound effects, the sound design, and the soundtrack are all amazing, and I would recommend, if you don't play the game, I'd recommend just giving these a listen. The next thing I'm going to be talking about is the gameplay mechanics. I don't think this is necessarily too important as long as it works in a game like Amnesia. What I mean by that is, do I feel like I can progress through the game and survive a horror without the game breaking, without feeling I am immobile or the movement's too clunky, or feeling like I can't do what I want to do in order to progress and in order to survive? I did notice it a few times that moving around felt a little clunky, it felt a little slow. Honestly, sometimes it felt even more slow than in Dark Descent, but not by much. A perfect example of this is whenever I would be crouching and trying to walk up an incline, occasionally I wouldn't be able to get on the incline. Also, sometimes jumping over obstacles or going under obstacles felt a little bit less fluid than I would have wanted it to, but you were still able to do it. If anybody's played Amnesia Dark Descent or Machine for Pigs, the gameplay of Amnesia Rebirth is very, very similar. In terms of the mechanics, they're not trying to reinvent the wheel, which I honestly think is fine. I don't think this game needs to implement a crazy amount of new gameplay mechanics in order to make it better than its predecessors. I think the company made the right decision in focusing more on the scare factors and the story over gameplay mechanics. Just to give a quick overview of the mechanics, so anybody watching who doesn't know the mechanics will know. Basically, you play as Tazi, and as you progress through the game, you're, recovering lost steps and trying to figure out what happened, cure the amnesia, so to speak, right? And as you do this, you traverse through many, many dark corridors. And all the while you're doing this, you're trying your best not to go insane due to how dark it is. One of the things that the Amnesia series does really well is how it plays off of the idea of darkness. So the whole time you're playing the game, you're trying to mitigate the effects of darkness. And of course, to do that is to create light. So in order to create light, you are given matches and a lantern. And the matches you can use to light candles and other things as you traverse through, the hallways, the passages, etc. And the lantern you just refuel with oil as you go through the game. You'll find little things of oil and you'll find matches and whatnot. All the while you're doing this, you're trying to not be seen and killed by monsters. Now, I'm not going to spoil how many monsters there are or when you're going to encounter monsters, but basically throughout the game there are sprinklings of monster encounters, and you have to sneak by them, try to survive, all while not going crazy in the darkness. So you somehow have to sneak past the monsters and whatnot while creating light for yourself so you don't go crazy. It's a really nice balance that the series finds between, handling darkness, but also utilizing darkness to hide from enemies. And I think that Amnesia Rebirth did that really well too. But that's basically it. The mechanics are ultimately very simple, which I think are really great because it being simple allows you to not worry about them too much, so it doesn't distract the player from just how scary everything actually is. I feel like if you had to spend so much time just trying to min-max everything every little step of the way, I think it would take away from some of the horror elements. It's kind of like when I think of games like Slender the Arrival, like the game ultimately isn't that amazing, but like it's simple. Like they don't try to add all these intricate mechanics to try and make the game feel and play like super in-depth. They just don't need to do that. And I don't think Amnesia needs to do that either. And Amnesia, I think, is definitely a better game, better series, but just, my point is Amnesia Rebirth has pretty simple mechanics, and that's a good thing. A staple of the Amnesia series games is a puzzle system that accompanies the story and the progression and the horror elements, etc. Now, just because it's a staple of the series doesn't necessarily mean that I enjoy the puzzles in the games. This might be a bit of a hot take, but I'm not really a huge fan of the puzzles in The Dark Descent, nor in Machine for Pigs. In general, I'm not even sure I really enjoy puzzles in these kinds of survival horror games, where the main objective of the game is based around hiding and running from monsters. Especially when the puzzles involve collecting items throughout the space and trying to build or create something when there's nothing really going on. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy puzzle games for the most part, but I don't think that in a horror survival game that puzzles necessarily provide any more depth and, that extra oomph to the experience, For example, I love The Dark Descent. I think it's a great game overall. I think it's genuinely scary. I think the story progression is really great. But there are multiple times throughout the game where you encounter a puzzle, and in order to solve the puzzle, you better hope you found, X, Y, and Z items before in other rooms, around the castle, wherever they might be, right? And you're supposed to take these puzzle pieces, utilizing notes you find, etc., and try to, craft a alchemical ingredient or, whatever it is you're trying to build, right? But like a lot of the time, if you didn't find the item somewhere, you're going to be walking around the room trying to figure out where the item is and or just what you're doing in the puzzle. Now, maybe that's just me being a dum-dum, but I do recall having to go back a lot and, retrace my steps, going back to old rooms, trying to find pieces that I might not have picked up. I think it killed a lot of time, and I think it negatively affected the experience of the game, which is to be scared and immersed in a story. Basically what I'm saying is, if there's a puzzle that you encounter that's extremely vague and ambiguous, you spend a lot of time just trying to backtrack and try to figure out where the items are that you missed or kind of how the items work together, and I feel like that really detracts from the horror elements of the game. I feel like it could be a nuisance, and I feel like it can become it's very unnecessarily tedious and tiresome. Now, of course, with that being said, I didn't necessarily enjoy the puzzles in Amnesia Rebirth, but I don't think that they were nearly as vague as they were in The Dark Descent. Do I think the puzzles in Amnesia Rebirth are horrible? No. Do I think they're interesting? Not really. I would really have liked to see the puzzles pull the player into the story more. Perhaps the puzzles are more deeply integrated into the story or into the areas, into the atmosphere, But I get that it's probably pretty hard to do that in a survival horror game, but I feel like if it is just hard to do that, just don't put it in, But that's just me and my bias towards puzzles in these games, so, take it with a grain of salt. If you really enjoy the puzzles in Dark Descent, you're probably going to enjoy the puzzles in Amnesia Rebirth. However, if you really like the ambiguity and vagueness and just being lost trying to figure out puzzles in Dark Descent, then Amnesia Rebirth's puzzles are probably going to seem a lot easier to you. I'm going to quickly talk about the graphics of the game, the graphical fidelity of Amnesia Rebirth. But before I talk about the graphics themselves, I think a good precursor is to talk about the art style of Amnesia Rebirth and the series as a whole. From what I can tell from playing the games, the art style in the Amnesia series is structured by being very dark and gritty and cramped. Honestly, at times it almost feels pastel-y. What I mean by pastel-y is, when playing through The Dark Descent, there are multiple times where I almost felt like I'm in a painting. Everything feels very ethereal almost at times, and I think that really helps play into the overall psychological horror elements that are presented in the series. Amnesia Rebirth's art style is very similar. There are countless corridors that feel very, very dark, gritty, cramped, kind of grungy, if that makes sense. As you move through very specific areas in the game, you really feel like this whole area is just completely molding in with corruption and fear and abandonment, and some places look like they're completely falling apart, but they're also being taken over, overcome by this feeling of dread and presented story elements that I won't get into because I don't want to spoil anything. With every new game in the series, the art style is relatively similar, but it might need to be adapted if a new game takes place in a different area, right? I felt like the shift from The Dark Descent to Machine for Pigs, I feel like the art style was adapted a little bit, but it felt very, very similar, which is fine. I enjoy the art style in the series, so that was fine for me. I think that they also transitioned the art style pretty well and fluidly into Rebirth, but Rebirth ultimately takes place in a very different setting from The Dark Descent in general, right? I mean, in Amnesia Rebirth, you're in a desert setting, and the buildings you go into are, intertwined with this setting. And of course, other settings that are presented, but I don't want to get too much into spoilers. What I'm trying to get at is that the art style is tweaked a little bit to better adapt to the setting. And in doing so, they utilize, different blendings of colors. As you play through the game, the colors are very orangey and tan, and I think they blend really well. And I think that they are similar to The Dark Descent in the sense that there are many times where you feel like this whole place you're in is crumbling, falling apart, abandoned, but also almost ethereal, almost as if you are molding into the environment around you, which I think the series does really well. And I think Amnesia Rebirth does it really well too. Kind of like what I talked about before in terms of the gameplay mechanics, I don't think they needed to reinvent the wheel in terms of the graphics, and they didn't, and that's fine. From what I saw, it seems more polished. Could they have made the graphics a little bit better? Yes, but at the same time, whether they did or didn't, I don't think it would really take away from the experience. Honestly, the graphics are good enough to make the game feel pretty, make the game feel like I'm in this new crazy world, so that's fine, it gets a pass for me. I feel like at the end of these videos, I should probably say whether or not I think the game is worth it, whether or not you should buy it. I bought the game for $30 the day it came out, and I can honestly say the game is worth $30. I would also, though, recommend getting it on sale. I feel like it'll probably go on sale within the next year, so you could do that. Or you could just not buy it and, watch my spicy playthrough. Alright, here's another card. You should click on it. You should probably do it. Overall, I would say Amnesia Rebirth is a really good game, and I'm really happy I played through it, and I would consider it in some respects a breath of fresh air for the series. I think the story felt more immersive than Dark Descent and Machine for Pigs. I think the game is incredibly scary, and I think they did an amazing job in terms of fitting the idea of ambiguity, the unknown, with jump scares, with what's right in front of you. I think those two ideas are molded together really well in this game. The scare factors could have been a little bit more touched upon. I feel like the encounters could have been a little bit more unique. The horror elements could have been a little bit fine-tuned. But those are just my opinions. Overall, I don't think they deter from the game and the story enough to make me feel like you shouldn't play it. It's a really good game. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. If you like the content, leave a like down below, comment, and subscribe. That would really mean a lot to me. If you want to see another one of my more candid conversational reviews, I posted one about the Back 4 Blood Alpha, and I'm talking about whether or not it really feels like Left 4 Dead 3. You should check it out. Thank you so much. I am the gladdest, and I will see you next time.